What you're about to hear is not folklore or legend, it is documented history. In the early 13th century, an empress of one of the most powerful dynasties in Asia faced a fate so brutal that chroniclers struggled to record it. Her suffering was not accidental. It was calculated, deliberate, and designed to send a message that would echo across continents. This is the story of how Genghis Khan used terror, not just as a weapon of war, but as an instrument of psychological domination. What happened to the Jin Empress was worse than death. It was the complete destruction of dignity, power, and humanity itself. The year was 1215. The Mongol Empire, under the command of Genghis Khan, had been waging a relentless campaign against the Jin dynasty, which ruled northern China. For years, the Jin had resisted, confident in their fortified cities and vast armies. But Genghis Khan was not a conventional enemy. He did not merely seek territory, he sought submission. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital known today as Beijing, lasted for months. Starvation ravaged the population, disease spread through the streets. When the city finally fell, it was not through honorable combat, but through the slow collapse of hope itself. Among those captured was the Jin Empress, a woman whose very existence symbolized the power and legitimacy of the dynasty. In Chinese imperial culture, the empress was more than a ruler's wife. She was the mother of the nation, the embodiment of celestial favor. To harm her was to strike at the heart of the empire's spiritual and political authority. Genghis Khan understood this. He understood that to break the Jin, he needed to break their symbols. And so, the empress became the centerpiece of a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror. Historical records from multiple sources, including Chinese chronicles and Persian accounts by historians like Rashid al-Din, describe what followed. The empress was not executed quickly or privately. Instead, she was paraded through the streets of Zhongdu in full view of the devastated population. Her royal garments were stripped away. Her hair, which in Chinese tradition was never to be seen loose by anyone but her husband, was cut or torn. She was exposed, humiliated, and made to walk among the ruins of her own capital, while Mongol soldiers jeered and threatened her. This was not random cruelty. It was theater. Every moment was designed to demonstrate that the old order was dead. The violation that followed was systematic. According to several historical accounts, the empress was subjected to sexual violence by multiple soldiers. This was not an act of individual brutality, but a sanctioned practice within Mongol military strategy. The deliberate rape of enemy noblewomen served a dual purpose. It demoralized the conquered population and symbolically transferred power from the defeated rulers to the victors. In the patriarchal societies of the time, the violation of a woman of such status was understood as the ultimate desecration of her family's honor and the dynasty's legitimacy. The empress, once untouchable, was made utterly powerless. But the physical violation was only the beginning. The Mongols employed torture methods that were designed to prolong suffering rather than hasten death. Some sources suggest the empress was subjected to the Mongol practice known as the wooden horse, a device where the victim was forced to straddle a sharp wooden wedge that slowly cut into the body under their own weight. Others mention exposure to extreme elements, sleep deprivation, and public beatings that were carefully calibrated to keep the victim conscious and aware. The goal was not to kill quickly, but to extract every possible moment of agony and humiliation before death finally came. The execution itself was a public spectacle. Large crowds were forced to witness it, ensuring that the message reached every corner of the city and beyond. The empress's death was slow, agonizing, and deliberately theatrical. Her screams were meant to be heard. Her suffering was meant to be seen. This was psychological warfare at its most refined, a demonstration that no status, no lineage, no divine mandate could protect anyone from Genghis Khan's wrath. The symbolism was clear. If even an empress could be destroyed so completely, what hope did ordinary people have? Contemporary accounts describe the aftermath of her death as a turning point in the Jin dynasty's resistance. Morale collapsed across the empire. Nobles who had considered continuing the fight surrendered instead. Cities that might have held out opened their gates without a siege. The terror generated by the Empress's fate did more to secure Mongol dominance than any military victory could have achieved. Genghis Khan had proven that he was willing to destroy not just armies, but the very concept of sacred authority itself. This was conquest through annihilation of spirit. The treatment of the Jin Empress was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader Mongol strategy of exemplary violence. Genghis Khan believed that one act of extreme brutality, widely publicized, could save countless battles. By making examples of high-status victims, he created an atmosphere of terror that preceded his armies. Cities would hear what had happened in Zhongdu and choose surrender over resistance. This calculated use of atrocity was revolutionary in its effectiveness and horrifying in its implementation. Historical sources disagree on some specific details of the Empress's torture, but they converge on the essential facts. She was captured, humiliated, violated, tortured, and executed in a manner designed to maximize both her suffering and its impact on observers. The Persian historian Juvaini, writing decades later, described the fall of Zhongdu as a lesson in the futility of resisting the Mongols. The Chinese chronicle Yuan Shi mentions the fate of imperial women captured during the siege, though it uses euphemistic language that only partially conceals the horrors described more explicitly in other sources. What makes this episode particularly chilling is its intentionality. The Mongol Empire operated under a clear doctrine: total submission or total destruction. There was no middle ground, no negotiated peace that allowed defeated rulers to retain dignity. The treatment of the Jin Empress embodied this philosophy completely. She represented everything the Jin dynasty stood for: continuity, legitimacy, divine right, and every aspect of her being was systematically destroyed. Her body was violated, her status annihilated, her humanity erased. What remained was a warning written in flesh and blood. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate witnesses. News of the Empress's fate spread throughout Asia via the Silk Road trade networks. Merchants, refugees, and diplomats carried the story from city to city. Each retelling amplified the terror. By the time Mongol armies approached new territories, their reputation preceded them. Leaders faced an impossible choice: resist and face total annihilation, or submit and perhaps preserve some semblance of order. Most chose submission. In this way, the suffering of one woman became a weapon that conquered nations. Modern historians debate the ethics of studying such atrocities. Some argue that focusing on extreme violence sensationalizes history and obscures the complexity of the Mongol Empire's achievements in law, trade, and cultural exchange. Others contend that understanding the full scope of Mongol military tactics, including their use of terror, is essential to comprehending how such a small population conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Empress's story is uncomfortable precisely because it forces us to confront the human cost of empire building. The Mongol approach to warfare was shaped by their nomadic origins and harsh environment. On the steppes, survival required absolute decisiveness and the ability to inspire fear in enemies and loyalty in allies. Mercy was often seen as weakness, while demonstrated brutality was considered strategic intelligence. Genghis Khan himself had survived a childhood marked by betrayal, slavery, and violence. He understood viscerally that power came not from being loved, but from being feared, to the point where resistance seemed irrational. The treatment of high-status female captives was particularly strategic. In patriarchal societies across Asia, the honor of a family and dynasty was intimately tied to the chastity and dignity of its women. By violating and torturing noble women, the Mongols attacked the very foundation of their enemies' social order. This was not mindless savagery. It was culturally informed warfare that targeted the psychological vulnerabilities of specific societies. The Mongols adapted their terror tactics to the cultural contexts they encountered, maximizing their effectiveness. The Jin dynasty never fully recovered from the fall of Zhongdu. Though pockets of resistance continued for years, the psychological blow of the capital's fall and the fate of the imperial family had shattered the dynasty's claim to the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule in Chinese cosmology. When an empress could be so thoroughly humiliated, the dynasty's connection to heaven seemed severed. This spiritual defeat was as important as any military loss. By 1234, the Jin dynasty had been completely absorbed into the Mongol Empire. The empress herself remains largely anonymous in historical records. Sources refer to her by title rather than name, which was common for women in Chinese historical texts, but also serves to make her suffering more universal and symbolic. We know she was likely educated, cultured, and raised from birth to embody imperial virtue. Her entire existence had been preparation for a role of dignity and power. The contrast between what she was meant to be and what she became in her final days represents the totality of the Jin dynasty's collapse. Some accounts suggest the empress attempted to maintain her dignity even during her ordeal. Reports describe her refusing to beg for mercy or to acknowledge her captor's authority. If true, this resistance would have been seen as defiance, requiring even greater efforts to break her spirit. The Mongols respected courage in their own warriors, but saw defiance in defeated enemies as a challenge requiring absolute crushing. Any attempt she made to preserve her dignity would have been met with escalated brutality designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The specific torture methods employed against the empress reflected a sophisticated understanding of human suffering. The Mongols did not rely solely on physical pain. They incorporated psychological torment, public humiliation, and the destruction of identity. The empress was forced to witness the destruction of her city and people. She was stripped of the symbols that defined her status. She was violated in ways that destroyed her role as a sacred figure. Each element of her torture was designed to break a different aspect of her being until nothing remained but raw suffering. The use of sexual violence as a weapon of war has been documented across virtually every major conflict in human history, but the Mongol Empire systematized it to an unusual degree. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, generally prohibited rape against Mongol women under severe penalties, but it said nothing about the treatment of enemy women. This created a deliberate double standard, where the protection of Mongol honor and the violation of enemy honor were both codified practices. The empress's violation was not a breakdown of military discipline, it was policy. Historical trauma from the Mongol conquests echoes through the cultural memory of affected regions even today. In China, Russia, Persia, and Eastern Europe, the Mongol invasions remain synonymous with devastation and terror. The specific stories of individual victims like the Jin Empress became cautionary tales passed down through generations. These narratives shaped how subsequent societies understood power, vulnerability, and the cost of resistance. The Empress's suffering became a teaching story about the consequences of defeat. Modern psychological research into mass violence and atrocity helps explain the calculated nature of the Mongol approach. Studies show that extreme public violence against symbolic figures creates a climate of learned helplessness in populations. When people witness that even the most powerful among them can be completely destroyed, they internalize the futility of resistance. The Mongols intuitively understood this principle centuries before it was scientifically documented. Their use of exemplary violence was psychological warfare at its most effective. The documentation of the Empress's fate comes from multiple cultural sources, which gives it historical credibility despite the uncomfortable nature of the content. Chinese sources, written by survivors and later scholars, describe the fall of Zhongdu and the fate of the imperial family. Persian historians working for later Mongol Khans recorded the empire's expansion with remarkable detail. Even European sources, based on reports from travelers and missionaries, mention the terror tactics employed by Mongol armies. The convergence of these accounts across different cultures and languages suggests a historical core of truth beneath the horrifying details. The Empress's death marked not just the end of a life, but the end of an era. The Jin dynasty had represented a continuation of Chinese imperial tradition stretching back centuries. Its destruction by foreign invaders threatened the very concept of Chinese civilization as the eternal center of the world. The humiliation of the empress symbolized the humiliation of an entire cultural system. For Chinese observers, her fate was apocalyptic, a sign that the old certainties had collapsed and a new terrifying order was emerging. Genghis Khan's willingness to destroy traditional symbols of authority was part of what made him such a revolutionary military leader. Previous conquerors had often sought to legitimize themselves by adopting the trappings of the cultures they conquered. Genghis Khan rejected this approach entirely. He did not claim the mandate of heaven or seek to become a Chinese-style emperor. Instead, he demonstrated that Mongol power superseded all traditional sources of authority. The Empress's torture was a declaration that no cultural or spiritual power could stand against Mongol military might. The strategic calculation behind such brutality becomes clear when examining the broader patterns of Mongol conquest. Cities that surrendered immediately were often treated relatively well, with local governance structures left intact and citizens protected. Cities that resisted faced systematic destruction, with populations massacred and survivors enslaved. The difference in treatment was stark and deliberate. It created a powerful incentive structure. The Empress's fate was the ultimate expression of what happened to those who resisted. Her suffering saved Mongol lives by convincing others not to fight. Yet this strategy came at a moral cost that historians continue to grapple with. The Mongol Empire facilitated unprecedented exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica created trade routes and communication networks that shaped the medieval world, but these achievements were built on a foundation of terror and mass death. The suffering of individuals like the Jin Empress was the price paid for the empire's expansion. There is no way to reconcile these contradictions, only to acknowledge them fully. The Empress's torture also reflects the gendered nature of medieval warfare. Women of status were valuable as symbols, hostages, and tools of humiliation in ways that differed from male captives. Male nobles might be executed or forced to serve, but their treatment was generally more straightforward. Women faced violation and degradation that targeted their specific social roles. The Empress suffered not just as a defeated enemy, but specifically as a woman whose value in her society was tied to chastity, dignity, and maternal symbolism. Her torture exploited these gendered vulnerabilities deliberately. Contemporary accounts suggest that some Mongol commanders questioned the wisdom of such extreme measures, not on moral grounds, but on practical ones. Excessive brutality sometimes stiffened resistance rather than breaking it, as desperate populations concluded they had nothing to lose. However, Genghis Khan's approach generally proved effective enough that it became standard Mongol practice. The psychological impact of exemplary violence consistently outweighed any tactical disadvantages. The Empress's fate contributed to a pattern of conquest that brought a fifth of the world's population under Mongol rule. The specific details of the Empress's final hours remain partially obscured by the euphemistic language of historical chronicles and the loss of eyewitness accounts. What is clear is that she died slowly, publicly, and in extreme agony. Her death was witnessed by thousands and reported to millions. The exact methods of torture may vary between sources, but the essential facts do not. She was made to suffer as intensely and visibly as possible, and her suffering was intended to terrorize all who heard of it. In the aftermath of Zhongdu's fall, the Mongol army systematically looted the city for weeks. Treasures accumulated over centuries were carried off to Mongolia. Buildings were burned. Populations were sorted. Craftsmen and artisans were enslaved and sent to serve Mongol needs, while others were slaughtered or left to starve. The city that had been the proud capital of the Jin dynasty was reduced to ruins. When the Empress died, she died amid the ashes of everything her life had represented. The historical memory of the Empress's fate has been complicated by centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation. Some Chinese sources emphasize her suffering as an example of national humiliation. Others focus on her dignity and death as a model of imperial virtue. Mongol sources, when they mention such events at all, frame them as necessary measures against stubborn enemies. No source disputes that something horrific happened. They differ only in how to understand its meaning and significance. For Genghis Khan, the treatment of the Empress was consistent with his broader philosophy of warfare and empire. He famously said that the greatest happiness was to conquer one's enemies, to pursue them, to deprive them of their possessions, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, and to embrace their wives and daughters. This was not empty boasting. It was a statement of policy. The Empress's fate embodied this philosophy completely. She was conquered, pursued, deprived, made to witness the tears of her people, and violated. Every element of Genghis Khan's definition of victory was enacted upon her body. The Empress's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of historical memory and the limits of human cruelty. How do we remember empires built on such foundations? How do we acknowledge both the achievements and the atrocities? The Mongol Empire created networks that connected East and West, fostered religious tolerance in many contexts, and enabled cultural exchanges that enriched human civilization. But these accomplishments cannot erase the suffering of individuals like the Empress, whose agony was instrumentalized for imperial purposes. Modern descendants of the Mongol Empire, particularly in Mongolia, often celebrate Genghis Khan as a national hero and visionary leader. This is their right. He was the founder of their nation and their most significant historical figure. But this celebration coexists uneasily with the historical record of his methods. The Empress's torture is part of that record, an undeniable fact that complicates any simple narrative of heroism or villainy. History is rarely simple, and the most important figures are often the most contradictory. The Jin Empress died in 1215, but her story did not die with her. It became part of the collective memory of Chinese civilization's vulnerability to foreign invasion. It influenced how subsequent dynasties prepared for threats from the north. It shaped cultural narratives about honor, resistance, and the costs of defeat. Her suffering became a reference point for understanding the stakes of political conflict. In this way, her death continued to exert influence long after her body had turned to dust. The treatment of the Empress also reveals the limitations of status and power in the face of overwhelming force. She had been raised to believe in her divine right and absolute authority. The entire structure of Chinese imperial culture supported the idea that the emperor and empress were sacred figures beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Genghis Khan demolished this belief system by demonstrating that no one was untouchable. The Empress's torture was a lesson in the reality of power, that it comes not from tradition or divine mandate, but from the ability to inflict violence and compel obedience. Historical sources suggest that news of the Empress's fate reached even distant corners of Asia, carried by refugees and traders. The story grew in the telling, acquiring mythic proportions that sometimes obscured the historical reality beneath. But the core narrative remained consistent. The Jin Empress had suffered unimaginably, and her suffering had been deliberate. This message resonated across cultures and kingdoms. Rulers from Korea to Persia understood that the Mongol Empire played by different rules where sacred tradition and noble status offered no protection. The psychological sophistication of the Mongol approach to terror is particularly striking when viewed through a modern lens. They understood that fear was most effective when it was specific, vivid, and personal. Abstract threats of destruction were less powerful than concrete stories of individual suffering. By creating narratives around particular victims like the Empress, the Mongols ensured their terror campaign had faces, names, and details that people could imagine happening to themselves or their loved ones. This made the threat feel immediate and unavoidable. The Empress's torture also served an internal purpose within the Mongol military structure. Allowing soldiers to participate in the violation and humiliation of high-status enemy women served as a reward for victory and a bonding experience that reinforced group cohesion. This is a dark pattern repeated across many military cultures, the use of sexual violence against enemy populations as both a tactical weapon and a form of compensation for soldiers. The Empress's suffering thus served multiple purposes within Mongol strategic thinking. Some historical accounts suggest that members of the Jin imperial family who survived tried to memorialize the Empress in secret, risking their lives to perform proper funerary rites and record her dignity in death. If these accounts are accurate, they represent acts of extraordinary courage, defying Mongol authority to honor the memory of their fallen Empress. These small acts of resistance, though they could not change the broader outcome, demonstrated that the human spirit could not be completely crushed even under the most brutal occupation. The fall of Zhongdu and the fate of its empress marked a turning point in East Asian history. The balance of power shifted decisively toward the Mongol Empire, which would continue expanding for decades. The psychological impact of the empress's torture contributed to this expansion by creating an atmosphere where resistance seemed futile. Cities and kingdoms across Asia faced a terrible choice: fight and be destroyed utterly, or submit and perhaps survive. Most chose submission, and the Mongol Empire grew to dominate Eurasia. What happened to the Jin Empress was not unique in the annals of Mongol conquest, but it was perhaps the most symbolically significant. As the wife of an emperor and the embodiment of dynastic legitimacy, her complete destruction sent a message that resonated throughout the hierarchical societies of medieval Asia. If an empress could be reduced to such suffering, no one was safe. This was precisely the message Genghis Khan intended to send. He succeeded beyond measure. The historical record of the empress's suffering is difficult to read and difficult to reckon with. It forces us to acknowledge the depths of cruelty that human beings are capable of inflicting on one another, and the ways that such cruelty can be rationalized as strategic necessity. There is no comfort in this history, no easy moral lesson. There is only the stark reality of what happened. A woman of the highest status was systematically destroyed to serve the political and military objectives of a conquering empire. In the end, the story of the Jin Empress is a reminder that history is written in human suffering as much as in victories and achievements. Her name may be lost to time, but her fate is not. It stands as a testament to the brutality of medieval warfare, the effectiveness of terror as a weapon, and the terrible vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals when confronted with overwhelming force. Her story deserves to be told, not because it is pleasant, but because it is true, a dark chapter in human history that illuminates the costs of conquest and the methods by which empires are built. The broader context of Mongol torture practices reveals that the empress's suffering was part of a systematic approach to subjugation. The Mongols employed a hierarchy of punishments calibrated to the status of victims and the degree of resistance they had offered. Common soldiers who surrendered might be spared or enslaved. Officers who fought to the end were typically executed quickly. But rulers, nobles, and symbolic figures like the Empress faced prolonged torture designed to maximize humiliation. This graduated system of violence was not arbitrary. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to break the will of conquered populations. The specific torture techniques used against high-status prisoners drew from various cultural traditions the Mongols encountered during their expansion. Some methods originated in the steppes, adapted from practices used against tribal enemies. Others were borrowed from Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian cultures that the Mongols conquered. The empire became a clearinghouse for techniques of inflicting pain, with information about effective methods spreading through the military ranks. The Empress likely experienced a combination of indigenous Mongol practices and techniques specifically designed to humiliate someone of her cultural background. One particularly chilling aspect of the Empress's torture was the presence of forced witnesses. Historical accounts suggest that surviving members of the Jin court, palace servants, and city officials were compelled to watch her degradation. These witnesses were specifically chosen because they would survive to spread the story. Some were later released or escaped to carry news of what they had seen to other Jin territories. Others were kept alive as servants to the Mongols, living reminders of what happened to those who resisted. The psychological burden placed on these witnesses was itself a form of torture. They were forced to live with the memory of their empress's suffering and their own powerlessness to prevent it. The Empress's torture also had a temporal dimension that intensified its horror. It was not conducted quickly, but stretched across days or possibly weeks. Each day brought new humiliations and new pains. Prisoners who suffered such extended torture existed in a state of anticipation and dread, never knowing when the next violation would come or when death would finally end their suffering. This temporal prolonging of agony was deliberate. It gave more time for witnesses to observe and for news to spread. The Empress spent her final days or weeks in a state of sustained torment that defies comfortable comprehension. The religious and spiritual dimensions of the empress's suffering cannot be overlooked. In Chinese imperial ideology, the empress held a sacred position within the cosmic order. She was expected to perform rituals that maintained harmony between heaven and earth. Her violation represented not just a political defeat, but a spiritual catastrophe, evidence that the dynasty had lost its divine mandate. For observers steeped in this worldview, the empress's torture was apocalyptic. It suggested that the very structure of the cosmos had shifted, that the old gods had abandoned China to a foreign power that recognized no traditional sources of authority. The Mongol soldiers who participated in the empress's torture were themselves products of a brutal military culture. From childhood, Mongol warriors were trained to endure extreme hardship and to inflict violence without hesitation. Empathy toward enemies was seen as a dangerous weakness that could compromise military effectiveness. The soldiers who violated and tortured the empress were likely not acting out of personal sadism, but following orders and cultural expectations. This makes their actions no less horrific, but it contextualizes them within a military system that systematically brutalized both its victims and its own members. Historical sources indicate that the empress attempted at various points to negotiate, to plead, or to maintain some shred of dignity through silence. Each response was met with escalated violence. The Mongols interpreted any attempt at negotiation as evidence that more pressure was needed to achieve complete submission. Pleas for mercy were seen as weakness to be exploited. Dignified silence was viewed as defiance, requiring harsher methods to break. There was no response the empress could offer that would have shortened her suffering. The outcome had been predetermined before her torture even began. The medical reality of the torture the empress endured would have been excruciating beyond description. The human body has limits to pain tolerance, but those limits can be deliberately avoided by varying the intensity and location of torture. Methods that bring victims to the edge of unconsciousness, but then allow them to recover, ensure prolonged awareness of suffering. The empress would have experienced shock, infection, blood loss, and systemic trauma. Yet the torture was calibrated to keep her alive and conscious as long as possible. Ancient and medieval torturers possessed practical knowledge of human anatomy that allowed them to maximize suffering while delaying death. The psychological trauma inflicted on the empress paralleled the physical torture. She was forced to witness the destruction of her city and people. She knew that her husband, the emperor, had either fled or been killed. She understood that her children, if they had survived, faced uncertain fates. She watched the cultural and political world she had known her entire life collapse into chaos. The mental anguish of this awareness, combined with the physical torture, created a total assault on every aspect of her being. There was no refuge in her mind or body. Everything had become a source of pain. The aftermath of the empress's death saw the Mongols dispose of her body in a manner designed to deny her proper burial rites. In Chinese tradition, proper funerary practices were essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. Denying these rites was considered a fate worse than death itself, a condemnation to eternal wandering and suffering. Whether the empress's body was cremated, left unburied, or thrown into a mass grave, the denial of proper rites compounded the physical torture with spiritual annihilation. This attention to cultural sensitivities reveals how thoroughly the Mongols studied the societies they conquered. The story of the Jin Empress spread through oral tradition as well as written records. Survivors of Zhongdu's fall carried the tale with them as they fled to southern China and beyond. Each retelling added details or emotional weight that may not have been historically accurate, but that captured the essential horror of what had occurred. These oral traditions influenced how subsequent generations understood Mongol conquest as something beyond ordinary warfare, as a force that threatened not just life, but dignity, culture, and spiritual integrity. The empress became a ghost, haunting the Chinese historical consciousness. In the years following the empress's death, the Mongols continued their conquest of the Jin dynasty and eventually moved against the southern Song dynasty as well. Each campaign employed similar tactics of exemplary violence against symbolic figures. The lesson of the empress's fate was applied repeatedly across Asia. High-status prisoners, both male and female, faced calculated torture and humiliation designed to terrorize watching populations. The Mongol Empire refined terror into a science, and the Empress's suffering was one of the early demonstrations of this terrible expertise. The historical documentation of the Empress's fate exists in fragments across multiple sources, requiring scholars to piece together a coherent narrative from scattered references. Chinese sources often use euphemistic language, or simply note that unspeakable things were done. Persian historians writing for Mongol patrons sometimes provide more detail, but may exaggerate to glorify their employer's power. European sources, based on third-hand reports, sometimes conflate different events or add fantastical elements. Yet despite these complications, the core story remains consistent across sources. A powerful woman was captured and subjected to extreme torture as an instrument of political terror. The Empress's suffering raises profound questions about the nature of evil and the capacity for cruelty within human societies. Were the Mongols who tortured her monsters, or were they ordinary people shaped by their culture and circumstances into instruments of atrocity? This question has no comfortable answer. The historical record suggests they were the latter, normal individuals operating within a military and cultural system that normalized extreme violence. This is perhaps more disturbing than imagining them as inhuman monsters, because it forces us to recognize that such cruelty is a potential within all human societies under certain conditions. The long-term consequences of the Mongol terror campaign extended far beyond the immediate military victories. Populations that witnessed or heard about atrocities like the Empress's torture developed deep cultural trauma that influenced political and military thinking for generations. Subsequent Chinese dynasties invested heavily in border defenses and military preparedness, specifically to avoid another Mongol-style invasion. The memory of what happened to the Jin dynasty shaped strategic thinking for centuries. In this way, the Empress's death continued to influence history long after the Mongol Empire itself had fragmented and declined. Modern scholars who study the Mongol Empire face an ethical dilemma in how to present figures like Genghis Khan. On one hand, he was an undeniably transformative historical figure who reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Eurasia. On the other hand, his methods included systematic atrocities like the torture of the Jin Empress. Some scholars attempt to separate the man from his methods, arguing that he must be understood within his historical context. Others contend that certain acts are so heinous that they override historical achievements. The Empress's story sits at the heart of this debate, an undeniable fact that complicates any attempt at neutral historical assessment. The gendered nature of the Empress's torture reflects broader patterns in how warfare has historically targeted women's bodies as battlegrounds for male conflict. Across cultures and time periods, conquering armies have used sexual violence against women as a weapon to humiliate defeated male populations and to destroy the social fabric of conquered societies. The Empress's violation was an extreme example of this pattern, amplified by her symbolic importance. Her suffering was not just about her as an individual, it was about using her body to send messages to men and to entire populations about the totality of their defeat. The physical setting of the Empress's torture, the ruined streets of Zhongdu surrounded by devastation, added another layer of psychological impact. She was tortured amid the ashes of her own capital, with the smell of burning buildings and bodies in the air. The city that should have been her seat of power had become the stage for her complete humiliation. This geographical symbolism was not accidental. The Mongols understood that settings amplified meaning, that destroying someone in the heart of their own territory sent a more powerful message than doing so elsewhere. The absence of rescue or intervention during the Empress's torture speaks to the completeness of the Mongol victory. In Chinese literary and historical tradition, stories often featured loyal officials or brave warriors who risked everything to save their ruler. The Empress's story contains no such heroism, no dramatic rescue, no noble sacrifice that at least attempted to save her. This absence itself became part of the terror narrative. It demonstrated that the old certainties of loyalty and honor had collapsed in the face of Mongol power. No one came to save the Empress because no one could. The old world was dead. The duration of the Empress's suffering, measured in days or weeks rather than hours, created opportunities for witnesses to absorb and internalize the spectacle. Those forced to watch were not just seeing a single moment of violence, but living through an extended nightmare. The prolonged nature of the torture allowed fear to build, anticipated horrors to materialize, and hope to die slowly. For witnesses, each day brought the realization that yesterday's atrocities would be exceeded by today's. This psychological progression, from shock to despair to numb acceptance, mirrored the broader experience of populations living under Mongol conquest. The Empress's final moments, according to fragmentary accounts, came after days of sustained torture had reduced her body to a state of systemic failure. Whether she was finally executed or simply succumbed to her injuries remains unclear. What is documented is that her death, when it came, was treated as a public event. Her body was displayed to confirm her death and to provide a final moment of spectacle. Even in death, she remained an instrument of Mongol policy, a corpse that proved the futility of resistance and the cost of defying Genghis Khan's will. The Jin Empress died as she had lived, at the center of history, though in her death she became a symbol of defeat rather than power. Her suffering was instrumentalized, her body made into a weapon against her own people. There is no justice in this history, no redemption, only the brutal fact of what happened. 800 years later, we can look back at her fate with horror and grief, but we cannot change it. We can only remember, and in remembering, try to understand the darker chapters of human history that we must acknowledge if we are ever to move beyond them.